Cartesian linguistics, derives from this assumption. The Port-Royal grammar, for example, begins the discussion of syntax with the observation that there are three operations of our minds: conceiving, judging, and reasoning, p. 27, of which the third is irrelevant to grammar. It is taken up in the Port-Royal logic, which appeared 2 years later, in 1662. From the manner in which concepts are combined in judgments, the grammar deduces what it takes to be the general form of any possible grammar, and it proceeds to elaborate this universal underlying structure from consideration of the natural manner in which we express our thoughts, p. 30. 64 Most subsequent attempts to develop a schema of universal grammar proceed along the same lines. James Harris's Hermes, which does not bear the imprint of the Port-Royal grammar to the extent usual in 18th century work, also reasons from the structure of mental processes to the structure of language, but in a somewhat different way. In general, he maintains, when a man speaks, his speech or discourse is a publishing of some energy or motion of his soul, p. 223. 65 The powers of the soul are of two general types: perception, involving the senses and the intellect, and volition, the will, passions, appetites, all that moves to action, whether rational or irrational, p. 224. It follows that there are two kinds of linguistic acts: to assert, that is, to publish some perception either of the senses or the intellect, or to publish volitions, that is, to interrogate, command, pray, or wish, p. 224. The first type of sentence serves to declare ourselves to others, the second, to induce others to fulfill a need. Continuing in this way, we can analyze the volitional sentences in terms of whether the need is to have some perception informed or some volition gratified, the interrogative and requisitive modes, respectively. The requisitive is further analyzed as imperative or precative, depending on whether the sentence is addressed to. 78. Deep and surface structure. 79. Inferiors or non-inferiors. Since both interrogatives and requisitives serve to answer to a need, both types require a return in words or deeds, to the requisitive, and in words alone, to the interrogative, p. 293 f. 66 Thus their framework for the analysis of types of sentences is provided by a certain analysis of mental processes, pursuing the fundamental distinction between body and mind, Cartesian. Linguistics characteristically assumes that language has two aspects. In particular, one may study a linguistic sign from the point of view of the sounds that constitute it and the characters that represent these signs, or from the point of view of their signification, that is, the manner in which men use them for signifying their thoughts. Port-Royal grammar, p. 41. Cordemoy announces his goal in similar terms: in this discourse I make a precise survey of everything that speech, la parole, derives from the soul and everything it borrows from the body. Discours physique de la parole, preface. Similarly, Lamy begins his rhetoric by distinguishing between the soul of words, that is, their mental, spiritual aspect, what is particular to us, the capacity of expressing our ideas, from their body, their corporeal aspect, what the birds that imitate the voices of men have in common with us, namely, the sounds, which are signs of their ideas, de l'art de parler. In short, language has an inner and an outer aspect. A sentence can be studied from the point of view of how it expresses a thought, or from the point of view of its physical shape, that is, from the point of view of either semantic interpretation or phonetic interpretation. Using some recent terminology, we can distinguish the deep structure of a sentence from its surface structure. The former is the underlying abstract structure that determines its semantic interpretation, the latter, the superficial organization of units which determines the phonetic interpretation and which relates to their physical form of the actual utterance, to its perceived or intended form. In these terms, we can formulate a second fundamental conclusion of Cartesian linguistics, namely, that deep and surface structures need not be identical. The underlying organization of a sentence relevant to semantic interpretation is not necessarily revealed by the actual arrangement and phrasing of its given components. This point is brought out with particular clarity in the Port Royal grammar, in which a Cartesian approach to language is developed for the first time, with considerable insight and subtlety. 67 The principal form of thought, but not the only one, cf. p. 79 below, is the judgment, in which something is affirmed of something else. Its linguistic expression is the proposition, the two terms of which are the subject, which is that of which one affirms, and the predicate, which is that which is predicated, p. 29, prg 67. The subject and the attribute may be simple, as in earth is round, or complex, compose, as in an able magistrate is a man useful to the republic, or invisible God created the visible world. Furthermore, in such cases as these, the propositions 80. Cartesian linguistics contain, at least in our mind, several judgments, from which one can make as many propositions. Thus, for example, when I say invisible God created the visible world, three judgments that pass through my mind are included in this proposition. For I judge, 1. That God is invisible, 2. That he created the world, 3. That the world is visible, and of these three propositions, the second is the principal and essential one of the original proposition. But the first and the third are only subordinate, and comprise only part of the principal proposition, the first composing its subject, the third its predicate. p. 68, prg 99-100. In other words, the deep structure underlying the proposition invisible God created the visible world consists of three abstract propositions, each expressing a certain simple judgment, although its surface form expresses only the subject attribute structure. Of course, this deep structure is implicit only. It is not expressed, but is only represented in the mind. Now these subordinate propositions are often in our mind, without being expressed in words, as in the example cited, viz. Invisible God created the visible world. p. 68, prg 100. It is sometimes possible to express the deep structure in a more explicit way, in the surface form, as when I reduce the above example to these terms. God who is invisible created the world which is visible, pages 68-69, prg 100. But it constitutes an underlying mental reality, a mental accompaniment to the utterance, whether or not the surface form of the utterance that is produced corresponds to it in a simple, point-by-point manner. In general, constructions of a noun with a noun in apposition, an adjective, or a participle are based on a deep structure containing a relative clause. All these modes of speech include the relative pronoun in their meaning, and may be resolved by using it. p. 69, prg 100. The same deep structure may be realized differently in different languages, as when Latin has vidua canem currentum, and French chavoyan chien qui court, pages 69-70, prg 100. The position of the relative pronoun in the subordinate proposition, proposition incidentity, is determined by a rule that converts deep structure to surface structure. We see this, for example, in such phrases as God whom I love and God by whom the world has been created. In such cases, the relative pronoun is always placed at the beginning of the proposition, although, according to the meaning, it ought to be only at the end, unless it is governed by a preposition, for the preposition comes first, at least ordinarily. p. 71, prg 101. In the case of each of the sentences just discussed, the deep structure consists of a system of propositions, and it does not receive a direct, point-by-point expression in the actual physical object that is produced. To form an actual sentence from such an underlying system of elementary propositions, we deep and surface structure. 81. Apply certain rules, in modern terms, grammatical transformations. In these examples, we apply the rule preposing the relative pronoun that takes the place of the noun of the incident proposition, along with the preposition that precedes it, if there is one. We may then, optionally, go on to delete the relative pronoun, at the same time deleting the copular, as in do invisible, or changing the form of the verb, as in canis currens. Finally, we must, in certain cases, interchange the order of the noun and the adjective, as in habile magistrat. 68. The deep structure that expresses the meaning is common to all languages, so it is claimed, being a simple reflection of the forms of thought. The transformational rules that convert deep to surface structure may differ from language to language. The surface structure resulting from these transformations does not directly express the meaning relations of the words, of course, except in the simplest cases. It is the deep structure underlying the actual utterance, a structure that is purely mental, that conveys the semantic content of the sentence. This deep structure is, nevertheless, related to actual sentences in that each of its component abstract propositions, in the cases just discussed, could be directly realized as a simple proposition judgment. The theory of essential and incident propositions as constituent elements of deep structure is extended in the Port Royal Logic 69 with a more detailed analysis of relative clauses. There, a distinction is developed between explicative, non-restrictive or appositive, and determinative, restrictive, relative clauses. The distinction is based on a prior analysis of the comprehension and extension of universal ideas, 70 in modern terms, an analysis of meaning and reference. The comprehension of an idea is the set of essential attributes that define it, together with whatever can be deduced from them. Its extension is the set of objects that it denotes. The comprehension of an idea is the constituent parts which make up the idea, none of which can be removed without destroying the idea. For example, the idea of a triangle is made up of the idea of having 3 sides, the idea of having 3 angles, and the idea of having angles whose sum is equal to 2 right angles, and so on. The extension of an idea is the objects to which the word expressing the idea can be applied. The objects which belong to the extension of an idea are called the inferiors of that idea, which with respect to them is called the superior. Thus, the general idea of triangle has in its extension triangles of all kinds whatsoever. p. 51, PRL 39-40. In terms of these notions, we can distinguish such explications as Paris, which is the largest city in Europe, and man, who is mortal, from determinations such as transparent bodies, wise men, or a body which is transparent, men who are pious. Pages 59-60, 118, PRL 44-45, 89. A complex expression is a mere explication if either 1. The idea expressed by the complex expression is already contained in the comprehension of the idea expressed. 82. Cartesian Linguistics. By the principal word of the complex expression, or 2. The idea expressed by the complex expression is the idea of some accidental characteristic of all the inferiors of an idea expressed by the principal word. Pages 59-60, PRL 45. A complex expression is a determination if the extension of the idea expressed by the complex term is less than the extension of the idea expressed by the principal word. p. 60, PRL 45. In the case of an explicative relative clause, the underlying deep structure actually implies the judgment expressed by this clause, when its relative pronoun is replaced by its antecedent. For example, the sentence "men, who were created to know and love God," implies that men were created to know and love God. Thus, an explicative relative clause has the essential properties of conjunction. But in the case of a restrictive relative clause, a determination, this is obviously not true. Thus, in saying "men who are pious are charitable," We do not affirm either that men are pious or that men are charitable. In stating this proposition, we form a complex idea by joining together two simple ideas, the idea of man and the idea of piety, and we judge that the attribute of being charitable is part of this complex idea. Thus, the subordinate clause asserts nothing more than that the idea of piety is not incompatible with the idea of man. Having made this judgment, we then consider what idea can be affirmed of this complex idea of pious man. p. 119, PRL 89-90. Similarly, consider the expression the doctrine which identifies sovereign good with the sensual pleasure of the body, which was taught by Epicurus, is unworthy of a philosopher. 71. This contains the subject the doctrine which, taught by Epicurus, and the predicate unworthy of a philosopher. The subject is complex, containing the restrictive relative clause which identifies sovereign good with the sensual pleasure of the body, and the explicative relative clause which was taught by Epicurus. The relative pronoun in the latter has as its antecedent the complex expression the doctrine which identifies sovereign good with the sensual pleasure of the body. Since the clause which was taught by Epicurus is explicative, the original sentence does imply that the doctrine in question was taught by Epicurus. But the relative pronoun of the restrictive clause cannot be replaced by its antecedent, the doctrine, to form an assertion implied by the full sentence. Once again, the complex phrase containing the restrictive relative clause and its antecedent expresses a single complex idea formed from the two ideas of a doctrine and of identifying the sovereign good with the sensual pleasure of the body. All this information must be represented in the deep structure of the original sentence, according to the port-royal theory, and the semantic interpretation of the sentence must proceed in the manner just indicated. Utilizing this information, pages 119 to 120, PRL 90. A restrictive relative clause is based on a proposition, according to the port-royal theory, even though this proposition is not affirmed when the deep and surface structure. 83. Relative clause is used in a complex expression. What is affirmed in an expression such as men who are pious, as noted above, is no more than the compatibility of the constituent ideas. Hence, in the expression minds which are square are more solid than those which are round, we may correctly say that the relative clause is false, in a certain sense, since the idea of being square is not compatible with the idea of mind understood as the principle of thought. p. 124, PRL 93. Thus sentences containing explicative as well as restrictive relative clauses are based on systems of propositions, that is, abstract objects constituting the meanings of sentences. 72. But the manner of interconnection is different in the case of an explicative clause, in which the underlying judgment is actually affirmed, and a determinative clause, in which the proposition formed by replacing the relative pronoun by its antecedent is not affirmed but rather constitutes a single complex idea together with this noun. These observations are surely correct, in essence, and must be accommodated in any syntactic theory that attempts to make the notion deep structure precise and to formulate and investigate the principles that relate deep structure to surface organization. In short, these observations must be accommodated in some fashion in any theory of transformational generative grammar. Such a theory is concerned precisely with the rules that specify deep structures and relate them to surface structures, and with the rules of semantic and phonological interpretation that apply to deep and surface structures respectively. It is, in other words, in large measure an elaboration and formalization of notions that are implicit and in part expressly formulated in such passages as those just discussed. In many respects it seems to me quite accurate, then, to regard the theory of transformational generative grammar, as it is developing in current work, as essentially a modern and more explicit version of the port-royal theory. In the port-royal theory, The relative pronoun that occurs in the surface form does not always have the dual function of standing for a noun and connecting propositions. It may be shorn of its pronominal nature and may thus serve only the latter role. For example, in such sentences as I suppose that you will be wise and I tell you that you are wrong, we find that, in the deep structure, these propositions, you will be wise, you are wrong, make up only part of the whole propositions I suppose. And I tell you. Grammar, p. 73, prg 104 to 105. 73. The grammar goes on to argue that infinitival constructions play their same role in the verbal system that relative clauses play in the nominal system, providing a means for extending the verbal system through the incorporation of whole propositions. The infinitive is, among the other moods of the verb, what the relative is among the other pronouns, pages 111 to 112, prg 139, like the relative pronoun. The infinitive has, over and above the affirmation of the verb. 84. Cartesian Linguistics. The power to join the proposition in which it appears to another proposition, p. 112, prg 139. Thus the meaning of sio malum esse fugiendum is conveyed by a deep structure based on the two propositions expressed by the sentences sio and malum est fugiendum. The transformational rule, in modern terms, that forms the surface structure of the sentence replaces est by esse, just as the transformations that form such sentences as die, qui est, invisible acrylum and qui est, visible performs various operations of substitution, reordering, and deletion on the underlying systems of propositions. And from this has come the fact that in French we almost always render the infinitive by the indicative of the verb and the particle que, je sais que le mal est, a fewer, p. 112, prg 140. In this case, the identity of deep structure in Latin and French may be somewhat obscured by the fact that the two languages use slightly different transformational operations to derive the surface forms. The grammar goes on to point out that indirect discourse can be analyzed in a similar way. 74. If the underlying embedded proposition is interrogative, it is the particle if rather than that is introduced by the transformational rule, as in they asked me if I could do that, where the discourse which is reported is can you do that. Sometimes, in fact, no particle need be added, a change of person being sufficient, as in he asked me, who are you? As compared with he asked me who I was, p. 113, prg 140 to 141. Summarizing the port-royal theory in its major outlines, a sentence has an inner mental aspect, a deep structure that conveys its meaning, and an outer, physical aspect as a sound sequence. Its surface analysis into phrases may not indicate the significant connections of the deep structure by any formal mark or by the actual arrangement of words. The deep structure is, however, represented in the mind as the physical utterance is produced. The deep structure consists of a system of propositions, organized in various ways. The elementary propositions that constitute the deep structure are of the subject-predicate form, with simple subjects and predicates, that is, categories instead of more complex phrases. Many of these elementary objects can be independently realized as sentences. It is not true, in general, that the elementary judgments constituting the deep structure are no affirmed when the sentence that it underlies is produced. Explicative and determinative relatives, for example, differ in this respect. To actually produce a sentence from the deep structure that conveys the thought that it expresses, it is necessary to apply rules of transformation that rearrange, replace, or delete items of the sentence. Some of these are obligatory, further ones optional. Thus God, who is invisible, created the world, which is visible is distinguished from its paraphrase, invisible God created the visible world, by an optional deletion operation. But the transformation that substitutes a relative pronoun for the noun and then preposes the pronoun is obligatory. This account covers only the sentences based exclusively on judgments, but these, although the principal form of thought, do not exhaust the operations of deep and surface structure. 85. Our minds, and one must still relate to what occurs in our mind the conjunctions, disjunctions, and other similar operations of our minds, and all the other movements of our souls, such as desires, commands, questions, etc. p. 29, prg 67. In part, these are the forms of thought as signified by special particles such as and, not, or, if, therefore, etc. pages 137 to 138, prg 168. But with respect to these sentence types as well, an identity of deep structure may be masked through divergence of the transformational means whereby actual sentences are formed, corresponding to intended meanings. A case in point is interrogation. In Latin, the interrogative particle ne has no object outside the mind, but only marks the movement of the soul, by which we wish to know a thing, p. 138, prg 168. As for the interrogative pronoun, it is nothing more than a pronoun to which the signification of ne is added, that is to say, which, beyond taking the place of a noun like the other pronouns, further marks this movement of the soul which desires to know something and which demands to be instructed about it, p. 138, prg 168. But this movement of the soul can be signified in various ways other than by the addition of a particle, for example, by vocal inflection or inversion of word order, as in French, where the pronominal subject is transported to the position following the person marker of the verb, preserving the agreement of the underlying form. These are all devices for realizing the same deep structure, pages 138 to 139, prg 168 to 169. Notice that the theory of deep and surface structure as developed in the post-royal linguistic studies implicitly contains recursive devices and thus provides for infinite use of the finite means that it disposes, as any adequate theory of language must. We see, moreover, that, in the examples given, the recursive devices meet certain formal conditions that have no a priori necessity. In both the trivial cases, for example, conjunction, disjunction, etc., and the more interesting ones discussed in connection with relatives and infinitives, the only method for extending deep structures is by adding full propositions of a basic subject-predicate form. The transformational rules of deletion, rearrangement, etc., do not play a role in the creation of new structures. The extent to which the Port-Royal grammarians may have been aware of or interested in these properties of their theory is, of course, an open question. In modern terms, we may formalize this view by describing the syntax of a language in terms of two systems of rules, a base system that generates deep structures and a transformational system that maps these into surface structures. The base system consists of rules that generate the underlying grammatical relations with an abstract order, the rewriting rules of a phrase structure, grammar. The transformational system consists of rules of deletion, rearrangement, adjunction, and so on. The base rules allow for the introduction of new propositions, that is, there are rewriting rules of the form a.s, where s is the initial symbol of the phrase structure, grammar that constitutes the base. 86. Cartesian Linguistics. There are no other recursive devices. Among the transformations are those which form questions, imperatives, etc., when the deep structure so indicates, that is, when the deep structure represents the corresponding mental act in an appropriate notation. 75. The Port-Royal grammar is apparently the first to develop the notion of phrase structure in any fairly clear way. 76. It is interesting, therefore, to notice that it also states quite clearly the inadequacy of phrase structure description for the representation of syntactic structure and that it hints at a form of transformer. Rational grammar in many respects akin to that which is being actively studied today. Turning from the general conception of grammatical structure to specific cases of grammatical analysis, we find many other attempts in the Port Royal grammar to develop the theory of deep and surface structure. Thus adverbs are analysed as, for the most part, arising from the desire that men have to abbreviate discourse, thus as being elliptical forms of preposition noun constructions, for example, wisely for with wisdom or today for on this day, p. 88, prg 121. Similarly, verbs are analysed as containing implicitly an underlying copula that expresses affirmation, thus, once again, as arising from the desire to abbreviate the actual expression of thought. The verb, then, is a word whose principal use 77 is to signify affirmation or assertion, that is, to indicate that the discourse where this word is employed is the discourse of a man who not only conceives things, but who judges and affirms them, p. 90, prg 122. To use a verb, then, is to perform the act of affirming, not simply to refer to affirmation as an object of our thought, as in the use of a number of nouns which also mean affirmation, such as affirmans and affirmatio, p. 90, prg 122. Thus the Latin sentence Petrus vivit has the meaning Peter is living, p. 90, prg 123, and in the sentence Petrus affirmat is the same as est affirmans, p. 98, prg 128. It follows, then, that in the sentence affirmo, in which subject, copula, and attribute are all abbreviated in a single word, two affirmations are expressed. One regarding the act of the speaker in affirming, the other the affirmation that he attributes to himself, in this case. Similarly, the verb nego contains an affirmation and a negation, p. 98, prg 128, 78. Formulating these observations in the framework outlined above, what their Port Royal grammarians are maintaining is that the deep structure underlying a sentence such as Peter lives or God loves mankind, logic, p. 108, prl 83, contains a copula, expressing the affirmation, and a predicate, living, loving mankind, attributed to the subject of the proposition. Verbs constitute a subcategory of predicates. They are subject to a transformation that causes them to coalesce with a copula into a single word. The analysis of verbs is extended in the logic, where it is maintained, p. 117, that, despite surface appearances, a sentence with a transitive verb and its object, deep and surface structure, 87, expresses a complex proposition and in one sense two propositions. Thus we can contradict the sentence Brutus killed a tyrant by saying that Brutus did not kill anyone or that the person whom Brutus killed was not a tyrant. It follows that the sentence expresses the proposition that Brutus killed someone who was a tyrant, and the deep structure must reflect this fact. It seems that this analysis would also apply, in the view of the logic, if the object is a singular term, for example, Brutus killed Caesar. This analysis plays a role in the theory of reasoning developed later on in the logic. It is used to develop what is in effect a partial theory of relations, permitting the theory of the syllogism to be extended to arguments to which it would otherwise not apply. Thus it is pointed out, pages 206 to 207, PRL 159 to 160, that the inference from the divine law commands us to honor kings and Louis XIV as a king to the divine law commands us to honor Louis XIV is obviously valid, though it does not exemplify any valid figure as it stands, superficially. By regarding kings as the subject of a sentence contained implicitly in the original sentence, using the passive transformation 79 and otherwise decomposing the original sentence into its underlying prepositional constituents, we can finally reduce the argument to the valid figure Barbara. Reduction of sentences to underlying deep structure is resorted to elsewhere in the logic, for the same purpose. For example, Arnold observes, p. 208, PRL 160, that the sentence, "There are few pastors nowadays ready to give their lives for their sheep," though superficially affirmative in form, actually contains implicitly the negative sentence, "Many pastors nowadays are not ready to give their lives for their sheep." In general, he points out repeatedly that what is affirmative or negative in appearance may or may not be in meaning, that is, in deep structure. In short, the real logical form of a sentence may be quite different from its surface grammatical form. 80. The identity of deep structure underlying a variety of surface forms in different languages is frequently stressed throughout this period, in connection with the problem of how the significant semantic connections among the elements of speech are expressed. Chapter 6 of the Port Royal Grammar considers the expression of these relations in case systems, as in the classical languages, or by internal modification, as in the construct state in Hebrew, or by particles, as in the vernacular languages, or simply by a fixed word order. 81, as in the case of the subject-verb and verb-object relations in French. These are regarded as all being manifestations of an underlying structure common to all these languages and mirroring the structure of thought. Similarly, Lamy comments in his Rhetoric on the diverse means used by various languages to express the relations, and the consequence and interconnection between all the ideas that the consideration of things excites in our mind. De l'Art de Parler, pages 10 to 11. The Encyclopédiste du Massais also stresses the fact that case systems express relations among the elements of discourse that are, in other. 88. Cartesian Linguistics. Languages, expressed by word order or specific particles, and he points out the correlation between freedom to transpose and wealth of inflection. 82. Notice that what is assumed is the existence of a uniform set of relations into which words can enter, in any language, these corresponding to the exigencies of thought. The philosophical grammarians do not try to show that all languages literally have case systems, that they use inflectional devices to express these relations. On the contrary, they repeatedly stress that a case system is only one device for expressing these relations. Occasionally, they point out that case names can be assigned to these relations as a pedagogic device. They also argue that considerations of simplicity sometimes may lead to a distinction of cases even where there is no difference in form. The fact that French has no case system is in fact noted in the earliest grammars. Cf. Salin, p. 212. It is important to realize that the use of the names of classical cases for languages with no inflections implies only a belief in the uniformity of the grammatical relations involved, a belief that deep structures are fundamentally the same across languages, although the means for their expression may be quite diverse. This claim is not obviously true. It is, in other words, a non-trivial hypothesis. So far as I know, however, modern linguistics offers no data that challenge it in any serious way. 83. As noted above, the Port Royal theory of grammar holds that for the most part, adverbs do not, properly speaking, constitute a category of deep structure but function only for signifying in a single word what could otherwise be indicated only by a preposition and a noun. p. 88, PRG 121. Later grammarians simply drop the qualification to for the most part. Thus for du Massais, what distinguishes adverbs from other kinds of words is that adverbs have the value of a preposition and a noun, or a preposition with its complement. They are words which abbreviate. p. 660. This is an unqualified characterization, and he goes on to analyze a large class of items in this way. In our paraphrase, as deriving from a deep structure of the form, preposition complement. This analysis is carried still further by E.84. He, incidentally, maintains that, although an adverbial phrase such as with wisdom does not differ from the corresponding adverb wisely in its signification, it may differ in the accessory ideas associated with it. When it is a matter of contrasting an action with a habit, the adverb is more appropriate for indicating the habit and the adverbial phrase for indicating the action. Thus I would say a man who conducts himself wisely cannot promise that all his actions will be performed with wisdom. P. 342. 85. This distinction is a particular case of the antipathy that all languages naturally show towards a total synonymity, which would enrich an idiom only with sounds that do not subserve accuracy and clarity of expression. Earlier grammarians provide additional instances of analysis in terms of deep structure, as, for example, when imperatives and interrogatives are analyzed as deep and surface structure. 89. In effect, elliptical transforms of underlying expressions with such supplementary terms as I order you, or I request. 86. Thus come see me has the deep structure I order, beg you to come see me, who found it, has the meaning of I ask who found it, etc. Still another example that might be cited is the transformational derivation of expressions with conjoined terms from underlying sentences, in the obvious way, for example, in booze up, sit, pp. 399f. Buse's discussion of conjunctions also provides somewhat more interesting cases, as, for example, when he analyzes how, comment, as based on an underlying form with manner, mania, and a relative clause, so that the sentence I know how it happened has the meaning of I know the manner in which it happened, or when he analyzes the house which I acquired. In this way, the underlying deep structure with its essential and incident propositions is revealed. An interesting further development, along these lines, is carried out by Massey in his theory of construction and syntax. 87. He proposes that the term construction be applied to the arrangement of words in discourse, and the term syntax to the relations which words bear to one another. For example, the three sentences accepi literas to as accepi literas, and literas accepi to as exhibit three different constructions, but they have the same syntax. The relations among the constituent elements are the same in all three cases. Thus, each of these three arrangements produces the same meaning, since, in the mind, I have received your letter. He goes on to define syntax as what brings it about, in every language, that words produce the meaning we wish to arise in the minds of those who know the language. The part of grammar that provides knowledge of the signs established in a language to produce understanding in the mind, pages 229 to 231. The syntax of an expression is thus essentially what we have called its deep structure, its construction is what we have called its surface structure. 88. The general framework within which this distinction is developed is the following. An act of the mind is a single unit. For a child, the idea, sentiment, that sugar is sweet is at first an unanalyzed, single experience. P. 181. For the adult, the meaning of the sentence sugar is sweet, the thought that it expresses, is also a single entity. Language provides an indispensable means for the analysis of these otherwise undifferentiated objects. It provides a means of clothing a thought, so to speak, of rendering it perceptible, of dividing it, of analyzing it, in a word, of making it such that it is communicable to others with more precision and detail. Thus, particular thoughts are each an ensemble, so to speak, a whole that the usage of language divides, analyzes and distributes into parts by means of different articulations of the speech organs which form the words. P. 184. Similarly, The perception of speech is a matter of determining the unified and undifferentiated thought from the succession of words. The words work together to produce the whole sense or the thought we wish to arise in the 90. Cartesian Linguistics. Minds of those who read or hear them, p. 185. To determine this thought, the mind must first discover the relations among the words of the sentence, that is, its syntax. It must then determine the meaning, given a full account of this deep structure. The method of analysis used by the mind is to bring together those words that are related, thus establishing a meaningful order, ordere significative, in which related elements are successive. The actual sentence may, in itself, have this meaningful order, in which case it is called a simple construction, natural, necessary, meaningful, assertive, p. 232. Where it does not, this meaningful order must be reconstructed by some procedure of analysis. It must be re-established by the mind, which grasps the meaning, sense, only by this order, pages 191 to 192. To understand a sentence of Latin, for example, you must reconstruct the natural order that the speaker has in his mind, p. 196. You must not only understand the meanings of each word, but, furthermore, you would not understand anything in it except by putting together in your mind the words in their relation to one another, and you can do this only after you have heard the whole sentence. Pages 198 to 199. In Latin, for example, it is the relative word endings which makes us consider the words in the completed proposition in accordance with the order of their interrelations, and hence in accordance with the order of the simple, necessary and meaningful construction, pages 241 to 242. This simple construction is an order which is always indicated, but rarely observed in the usual construction of languages whose nouns have cases, p. 251. Reduction to the simple construction is an essential first step in speech perception. The words form a whole that has parts. The simple perception of the relations between these parts makes us conceive the whole of them, and comes to us solely from the simple construction. Setting forth the words in accordance with the order of succession of their relations, this presents them in a manner that is best fitted to make us recognize these relations and to make the whole thought arise. Pages 287 to 288. Constructions other than the simple constructions, namely, figurative constructions, constructions figures, are understood only because the mind corrects their irregularities, with the help of accessory ideas which make us conceive what we read and hear as if the sense were expressed in the order of the simple construction. p. 292. In short, in the simple construction the relations of syntax are represented directly in the associations among successive words, and the undifferentiated thought expressed by the sentence is derived directly from this underlying representation, which is regarded throughout, as common to all languages, and, typically, as corresponding to the usual order of French, cf., for example, p. 193. The transformations which form a figurative construction effect reordering and ellipsis. The fundamental principle of all syntax, p. 218, is that reordering. Deep and surface structure. 91. And ellipsis must be recoverable by the mind of the hearer, cf. pp. 202, 210 ff. 277, that is, they can be applied only when it is possible to recover uniquely the strict metaphysical order of the simple construction. 89. Many examples of reduction to simple constructions are presented to illustrate this theory. 90. Thus the sentence "who said it" is reduced to the simple construction "the one who said it is which person." Salin, p. 93. The sentence "being loved as much as lovers, you are not forced to the shed tears" is reduced to "since you are loved as much as you are lovers, the sentence "it is better to be just than to be rich, to be reasonable than to be wise" is reduced to 4 underlying propositions, 2 negative, 2 positive, in the obvious way. p. 109, etc. A rather different sort of example of the distinction between deep and surface structure is provided by Massey's in his analysis, pages 179 to 180, of such expressions as "I have an idea" /fear /doubt, etc. These, he says, should not be interpreted as analogous to the superficially similar expressions "I have a book /diamond watch," in which the nouns are names of real objects that exist independently of our thought, mania de pensar. In contrast, the verb in "I have an idea" is a borrowed, emprunty, expression, produced only by imitation. The meaning of "I have an idea" is simply "I am thinking" or "I am conceiving something in such and such a way." Thus the grammar gives no license for supposing that such words as idea, concept, image stand for real objects, let alone perceptible objects. From this grammatical observation, it is only a short step to a criticism of the theory of ideas, in its Cartesian and empiricist forms, as based on a false grammatical analogy. This step is taken by Thomas Reid, shortly after. 91. As Massey indicates with abundant references, his theory of construction and syntax is foreshadowed in scholastic and Renaissance grammar, see note 67. But he follows the Port Royal grammarians in regarding the theory of deep and surface structure as, in essence, a psychological theory, not merely a means for the elucidation of given forms or for analysis of texts. As indicated above, it plays a role in his hypothetical account of the perception and production of speech, just as, in the Port Royal grammar, the deep structure is said to be represented in the mind as the utterance is heard or produced. As a final example of the attempt to discover the hidden irregularities under lying surface variety, we may mention the analysis of French indefinite articles in Chapter 7 of the Port Royal grammar, where it is argued, on grounds of symmetry of patterning, that de and day play the role of the plural of an, as in an crime see horrible mérite la mort, des crimes see horribles méritant la mort, de see horribles crimes méritant la mort, etc. To handle the apparent exception, il est coupable de crimes horribles, de horribles crimes. They propose the rule of cacophony that a de sequence is replaced by de. They also note the use of day as a realization of the definite article, and other uses of these forms. 92. Cartesian Linguistics. Perhaps these comments and examples are sufficient to suggest something of the range and character of the grammatical theories of the philosophical grammarians. As noted above, their theory of deep and surface structure relates directly to the problem of creativity of language use, discussed in the first part of the present work. From the standpoint of modern linguistic theory, this attempt to discover and characterize deep structure and to study the transformational rules that relate it to surface form is something of an absurdity. 92. It indicates lack of respect for the real language, that is, the surface form, and lack of concern for linguistic fact. Such criticism is based on a restriction of the domain of linguistic fact to physically identifiable subparts of actual utterances and their formally marked relations. 93. Restricted in this way, linguistics studies the use of language for the expression of thought only incidentally, to the quite limited extent to which deep and surface structure coincide. In particular, it studies sound meaning correspondences only insofar as they are representable in terms of surface structure. From this imitation follows the general disparagement of Cartesian and earlier linguistics. 94, which attempted to give a full account of deep structure even where it is not correlated in strict point-by-point fashion to observable features of speech. These traditional attempts to deal with the organization of semantic content as well as the organization of sound were defective in many ways, but modern critique generally rejects them more for their scope than for their failures. Description and explanation in linguistics. Within the framework of Cartesian linguistics, a descriptive grammar is concerned with both sound and meaning. In our terminology, it assigns to each sentence an abstract deep structure determining its semantic content and a surface structure determining its phonetic form. A complete grammar, then, would consist of a finite system of rules generating this infinite set of paired structures and thus showing how the speaker here can make infinite use of finite means in expressing his mental acts and mental states. However, Cartesian linguistics was not concerned simply with descriptive grammar, in this sense, but rather with grammaire générale, that is, with the universal principles of language structure. At the very outset of the work under review, a distinction was made between general and particular grammar. These are characterized by deux massés in the following way. Some points, observations, of grammar apply to all languages. These form what we call general grammar, for example, those we made regarding articulated sounds and the letters which are the signs of these sounds, the nature of words and the various ways they must be ordered or terminated in order to have meaning. Apart from these general points, there are some which are peculiar to one particular language, and these form the special grammar of that language. 95. Buse elaborates the distinction in the following way. Grammar, whose object is the expression of thought with the help of spoken or written words, comprises two sorts of principles. One sort, being immutably true and universally applicable, derive from the nature of thought itself, following its analysis and being its result. The other sort are only hypothetically true and depend on conventions which, being accidental, arbitrary and changeable, have given rise to different idioms. The first sort of principles constitute general grammar and the second are the object of various particular grammars. General grammar is therefore the rational science of the immutable and general principles of spoken or written language, whatever language, long, this may be. A particular grammar is the art of applying the arbitrary and usual conventions of a particular language to the immutable and general conventions of written or spoken language. 93. 94. Cartesian linguistics. General grammar is a science, because its object is rational speculation on the immutable and general principles of language. A particular grammar is an art, because it considers the practical application of the arbitrary and usual conventions of a particular language to the general principles of language. The science of grammar is anterior to all languages in so far as its principles presuppose only the possibility of languages and are the same as those which guide human reason in its intellectual operations, in short, because they are eternally true. The art of grammar, by contrast, is posterior to languages in so far as linguistic usages must exist before they can stand in an artificial relation to the general principles of language, and the analogical systems that form this art can be determined only by observations made on these pre-existent usages. 96. In his Éloge de deux massés, D'Alembert gives this account of philosophical grammar. Grammar is therefore the work of philosophers. Only a philosophical mind can assent to the principles on which its rules are based. This mind first recognizes, in the grammar of each language, the general principles which are common to all of them, and which form general grammar. It then distinguishes, among the usages peculiar to each language, those which can be founded on reason from those which are the work of chance or negligence. It observes the reciprocal influences that languages have had on each other and the alterations that this mingling has brought about without entirely destroying their individual character. It weighs their mutual advantages and disadvantages, differences in their construction, the diversity of their genius, their richness and freedom, poverty and servitude. The development of these various factors is the true metaphysics of grammar. Its subject. is to advance the human mind in the generation of its ideas and in the use it makes of words to transmit thoughts to other men. 97. The discovery of universal principles would provide a partial explanation for the facts of particular languages, insofar as these could be shown to be simply specific instances of the general features of language structure formulated in the Grammaire Generale. Beyond this, the universal features themselves might be explained on the basis of general assumptions about human mental processes or the contingencies of language use, for example, the utility of elliptical transformations. Proceeding in this way, Cartesian linguistics attempts to develop a theory of grammar that is not only general but also explanatory, raisonné. The linguistics of Port-Royal and its successors developed in part in reaction against the prevailing approaches represented, for example, in such work as Wegelis's Remarques sur la langue française, 1647. 98. Wegelis's goal is simply to describe usage which everyone recognizes as the master and ruler of living languages. Preface. His book is called Remarques, rather than Decisions, Oloics, because he is a simple observer, témoin. He disclaims any intention of explaining the facts of speech or finding general principles that underlie them, just as he generally suggests no modification or purification of usage on rational or aesthetic grounds. His grammar, then, is description and explanation in linguistics. 95. Neither explanatory or prescriptive. 99. He is quite aware of the problems of determining actual usage and provides an interesting discussion of elicitation procedures, pp. 503 f, in which, among other things, he points out the inadequacy of the kinds of direct question tests for grammaticalness that have occasionally been proposed and applied by structural linguists, with predictably inconclusive results. He does not restrict his descriptive comments to surface structure. 100. For example, he points out that one cannot determine from the form of a word whether it has an active meaning, signification, or a passive meaning or, ambiguously, both, pages 562 to 563. Thus, in the sentence "my esteem isn't something from which you can derive any great advantage," the phrase "my esteem" has the sense "the esteem which I hold for you," whereas in the sentence "my esteem does not depend on you," it means the esteem in which I am held or the esteem in which I may be held, and the same is true of such words as aid, help, and opinion. There are other examples of a concern for descriptive adequacy on a broad scale. At the same time, Wegelis's work foreshadows many of the defects of modern linguistic theory, for example, in his failure to recognize the creative aspect of language use. Thus, he regards normal language use as constructed of phrases and sentences that are authorized by usage, although new words, for example, brusque, pluant, can be correctly formed by analogy, pp. 568 f. His view of language structure, in this respect, seems not very different from that of Saussure, Jespersen, Bloomfield, and many others who regard innovation as possible only by analogy, by substitution of lexical items for items of the same category within fixed frames, cf. p. 65 above. The reaction of philosophical grammar is not against the descriptivism of Wegelis and others as such 101 but against the restriction to pure descriptivism. The Port-Royal grammar takes it as a general maxim for anyone working on a living language that the ways of speaking that are authorized by undisputed general usage must be accepted as good even if they go against the rules and analogy of the language. p. 83, PRG 113. Lamy, in his Rhetoric, echoes Wegelis in describing usage as the master and arbitrary ruler of languages and in holding that no one may contest this rule which necessity has established and the general agreement of people has confirmed. Op. Cit. p. 31. Dumas insists that the philosophical grammarian must consider the particular language he is studying in relation to what this language is in itself and not in relation to another language. 102 Philosophical grammar, then, was not characteristically attempting to refine or improve language, but to discover its underlying principles and to explain the particular phenomena that are observed. 103. The example which, for more than a century, was used to illustrate this difference between descriptive and explanatory grammar was provided by a Rule of Ageless, pp. 385f, regarding relative clauses, namely, the rule that a relative clause may not be added to a noun that has no articles or only the article. 96. Cartesian Linguistics. Indefinida. Thus, one cannot say tu effet sailor par avaris, qui est capable de tout, or tu effet sailor par avaris, don't la soif ni se pertis indera. Similarly, one cannot say tu est blessed en coup de fleck, qui est tot empoisonné, p. 385, although it is correct to say tu est blessed la fleck, qui est tot empoisonné, or tu est blessed en fleck, qui est tot empoisonné. In Chapter 9, the Port Royal Grammar first notes a variety of exceptions to this rule and then proposes a general explanatory principle to account both for the examples that fall under the rule of ageless and for the exceptions to his rule. 104 The explanation is, once again, based on the distinction between meaning and reference. In the case of a common noun, the meaning, signification, is fixed, except for ambiguity or metaphor, but the reference, estendu, varies, depending on the noun phrase in which the noun appears. A particular occurrence of a noun is called indeterminate when there is nothing that indicates whether it must be taken generally or particularly, and, if the latter, whether for a determinate or indeterminate particular. p. 77, prg 109, otherwise, it is determinate. Vagelus's rule is now restated in terms of determination. In current French usage, one may not put qui after a common noun unless it is determined by an article or some other thing that determines it no less than it would be determined by an article. p. 77, prg 109. A detailed analysis follows, attempting to show that the apparent counterexamples involve occurrences of nouns that are determined by some feature other than the article. In part, the analysis is based on assumptions about deep structure that are not without interest in themselves. The rule is also discussed by Dumas, Buse, and others at some length. We need not go into the details here. The point, in the present context, is that this was taken as a paradigm example of the necessity for supplementing descriptive statements with a rational explanation, if linguistics was to go beyond compilation of facts to true science, in the terminology of the day, if grammar was to become philosophical. In connection with the rule of ageless and several other cases, the explanations that are proposed, in universal grammar, have some substance and linguistic content. All too often, however, they are quite empty, and invoke assumptions about underlying mental reality in a quite mechanical and unrevealing way. In fact, it seems to me that in general the modern critique of philosophical grammar is quite misplaced. The error of this position is generally taken to be its excessive rationality and a priorism and its disregard for linguistic fact. But a more cogent criticism is that the tradition of philosophical grammar is too limited to mere description of fact, that it is insufficiently raisonné, that is, it seems to me that the faults, or limitations, of this work are just the opposite of those which have been attributed to it by modern critics. The philosophical grammarians considered a wide realm of particular examples. They tried to show, for each example, what was the deep structure that underlies its surface form and expresses the relations among elements that determine its meaning. To this extent, their description and explanation in linguistics. 97. Work is purely descriptive, Just as modern linguistics is purely descriptive in pursuit of its more restricted goal of identifying the units that constitute the surface structure of particular utterances, their arrangement into phrases, and their formally marked relations. Reading this work, one is constantly struck by the ad hoc character of the analysis, even where it seems factually correct. A deep structure is proposed that does convey the semantic content, but the basis for its selection, beyond mere factual correctness, is generally unformulated. What is missing is a theory of linguistic structure that is articulated with sufficient precision and is sufficiently rich to bear the burden of justification. Although the examples of deep structure that are given in abundance often seem quite plausible, they are unsatisfying, just as modern linguistic descriptions, though often quite plausible in their analysis of particular utterances into phonemes, morphemes, words, and phrases, remain unsatisfying, and for the same reason. In neither case do we have an underlying hypothesis as to the general nature of language that is sufficiently strong as to indicate why just these and not other descriptions are selected by the child acquiring the language or the linguist describing it, on the basis of the data available to them. 105. What is more, there is little recognition in philosophical grammar of the intricacy of the mechanisms that relate deep to surface structure, and, beyond the general outline sketched above, there is no detailed investigation of the character of the rules that appear in grammars or the formal conditions that they satisfy. Concomitantly, no clear distinction is made between the abstract structure underlying a sentence and the sentence itself. It is, by and large, assumed that the deep structure consists of actual sentences in a simpler or more natural organization, and that the rules of inversion, ellipsis, and so on, that form the full range of actual sentences simply operate on these already formed simple sentences. This point of view is explicit, for example, in de Massey's theory of construction and syntax, and it is undoubtedly the general view throughout. 106. The totally unwarranted assumption that a deep structure is nothing other than an arrangement of simple sentences can be traced to the Cartesian postulate that, quite generally, the principles that determine the nature of thought and perception must be accessible to introspection and can be brought to consciousness, with care and attention. Despite these shortcomings, the insights into the organization of grammar that were achieved in Cartesian linguistics remain quite impressive, and a careful study of this work can hardly fail to prove rewarding to a linguist who approaches it without prejudice or preconceptions as to the a priori limitations on permitted linguistic investigation. Beyond these achievements, the universal grammarians of the 17th and 18th centuries have made a contribution of lasting value by the very fact that they posed so clearly the problem of changing the orientation of linguistics from natural history to natural philosophy, and by stressing the importance of the search for universal principles and for rational explanation of linguistic fact, if progress is to be made toward this goal. Acquisition and use of language. We have so far extracted from Cartesian linguistics certain characteristic and quite important doctrines regarding the nature of language, and have, quite sketchily, traced their development during the period from Descartes to Humboldt. As a byproduct of the study of language, and against the background of rationalist theory of mind, certain views emerged as to how language is acquired and used. After a long interlude, these views are once again beginning to receive the attention that they deserve, although their appearance, like the reappearance of the central ideas of transformational grammar, was, in fact, a largely independent development. The central doctrine of Cartesian linguistics is that the general features of grammatical structure are common to all languages and reflect certain fundamental properties of the mind. It is this assumption which led the philosophical grammarians to concentrate on grammaire generale rather than grammaire particulière, and which expresses itself in Humboldt's belief that deep analysis will show a common form of language underlying national and individual variety. 107. There are, then, certain language universals that set limits to the variety of human language. 108. The study of the universal conditions that prescribe the form of any human language as grammaire générale. Such universal conditions are not learned, rather, they provide the organizing principles that make language learning possible, that must exist if they are to lead to knowledge. By attributing such principles to the mind, as an innate property, it becomes possible to account for the quite obvious fact that the speaker of a language knows a great deal that he has not learned. In approaching the question of language acquisition and linguistic universals in this way, Cartesian linguistics reflects the concern of 17th-century rationalistic psychology with the contribution of the mind to human knowledge. Perhaps the earliest exposition of what was to become a major theme throughout most of this century is Herbert of Cherbury's De Veritate, 1624, 109, in which he develops the view that there are certain principles or notions implanted in the mind that we bring to objects from ourselves, as a direct gift of nature, a precept of natural instinct, p. 133. Although these common notions are stimulated by objects, nevertheless, no one, however wild his views. 98. Acquisition and use of language. 99. Imagines that they are conveyed by objects themselves, p. 126. Rather, they are essential to the identification of objects and the understanding of their properties and relations. Although the intellectual truths comprised among the common notions seem to vanish in the absence of objects, yet they cannot be wholly passive and idle, seeing that they are essential to objects and objects to them. It is only with their aid that the intellect, whether in familiar or new types of things, can be led to decide whether our subjective faculties have accurate knowledge of the facts, p. 105. By application of these intellectual truths, which are imprinted on the soul by the dictates of nature itself, we can compare and combine individual sensations and interpret experience in terms of objects, their properties, and the events in which they participate. Evidently, these interpretive principles cannot be learned from experience in their entirety, and they may be independent of experience altogether. According to Herbert, they are so far from being drawn from experience or observation that, without several of them, or at least one of them, we could have no experience at all nor be capable of observations. For if it had not been written in our soul that we should examine into the nature of things, and we do not derive this command from objects, and if we had not been endowed with common notions, to that end, we should never come to distinguish between things, or to grasp any general nature. Vacant forms, prodigies, and fearful images would pass meaninglessly and even dangerously before our minds, unless there existed within us, in the shape of notions imprinted in the mind, that analogous faculty by which we distinguish good from evil. From where else could we have received knowledge? In consequence, anyone who considers to what extent objects in their external relationship contribute to their correct perception, who seeks to estimate what is contributed by us, or to discover what is due to alien or accidental sources, or again to innate influences, or to factors arising from nature, will be led to refer to these principles. We listen to the voice of nature not only in our choice between what is good and evil, beneficial and harmful, but also in that external correspondence by which we distinguish truth from falsehood. We possess hidden faculties which, when stimulated by objects, quickly respond to them. Pages 105 to 106. It is only by the use of these inborn capacities or common notions that the intellect can determine whether our subjective faculties have exercised their perceptions well or ill. p. 87. This natural instinct thus instructs us in the nature, manner, and scope of what is to be heard, hoped for, or desired. p. 132. Care must be taken in determining what are the common notions, the innate organizing principles and concepts that make experience possible. For Herbert, The chief criterion of natural instinct is universal consent, p. 139. But two qualifications are necessary. First, what is referred to is universal consent among normal men, p. 105. That is, we must put aside persons who are out of their minds or mentally incapable, p. 139, and those who are headstrong, foolish, weak-minded and imprudent, p. 125. And although these faculties may not ever be entirely absent, and even in madmen, drunkards, and infants extraordinary internal powers may be detected which minister to their safety. 100 Cartesian Linguistics. p. 125. Still we can expect to find universal consent to common notions only among the normal, rational, and clear-headed. Second, appropriate experience is necessary to elicit or activate these innate principles. It is the law or destiny of common notions and indeed of the other forms of knowledge to be inactive unless objects stimulate them, p. 120. In this respect, the common notions are like the faculties of seeing, hearing, loving, hoping, etc., with which we are born and which remain latent when their corresponding objects are not present, and even disappear and give no sign of their existence, p. 132. But this fact must not blind us to the realization that the common notions must be deemed not so much the outcome of experience as principles without which we should have no experience at all, and to the absurdity of the theory that our mind is a clean sheet, as though we obtained our capacity for dealing with objects from objects themselves, p. 132. The common notions are all intimately connected and can be arranged into a system, p. 120, and although an infinite number of faculties may be awakened in response to an infinite number of new objects, all the common notions which embrace this order of facts may be comprehended in a few propositions, p. 106. This system of common notions is not to be identified with reason. It simply forms that part of knowledge with which we were endowed in the primeval plan of nature, and it is important to bear in mind that it is the nature of natural instinct to fulfill itself irrationally, that is to say, without foresight. On the other hand, reason is the process of applying common notions as far as it can, pages 120 to 121. In focusing attention on the innate interpretive principles that are a precondition for experience and knowledge, and in emphasizing that these are implicit and may require external stimulation in order to become active or available to introspection, Herbert expressed much of the psychological theory that underlies Cartesian linguistics, just as he emphasized those aspects of cognition that were developed by Descartes and, later, by the English Platonists, Leibniz, and Kant. 110. The psychology that develops in this way is a kind of Platonism without pre-existence. Leibniz makes this explicit in many places. Thus he holds that nothing can be taught us of which we have not already in our minds the idea, and he recalls Plato's experiment with the slave boy in the Meno as proving that the soul virtually knows those things, that is, truths of geometry, in this case, and needs only to be reminded, animadverted, to recognize the truths. Consequently, it possesses at least the idea upon which these truths depend. We may say even that it already possesses those truths, if we consider them as the relations of the ideas, section 26. 111. Of course, what is latent in the mind in this sense may often require appropriate external stimulation before it becomes active, and many of the innate principles that determine the nature of thought and experience may well be. Acquisition and use of language. 101. Applied quite unconsciously. This Leibniz emphasizes, in particular, throughout his nouveau essays, that the principles of language and natural logic are known unconsciously. 112. and that they are in large measure a precondition for language acquisition rather than a matter of institution or training, is the general presupposition of Cartesian Linguistics. 113 when Demi, for example, considers language acquisition, op. Cit. pp. 40 ff. He discusses the role of instruction and condition of a sort, but he also notices that much of what children know is acquired quite apart from any explicit instruction. 114 and he concludes that language learning presupposes possession of wholly developed reason, la raison tout entière, for indeed this way of learning to speak is the result of discernment so great and reason so perfect that it is impossible to conceive of any more marvelous. p. 59. Rationalist conclusions reappear with some of the Romantics as well. Thus A.W. Schlegel writes that human reason may be compared to a substance which is infinitely combustible but does not burst into flame on its own. A spark must be thrown into the soul. De l'Etymologie and General, p. 127. Communication with an already formed intellect is necessary for reason to awaken, but external stimulation is only required to set innate mechanisms to work. It does not determine the form of what is acquired. In fact, it is clear that this acquisition of language through communication already presupposes the ability to invent language, Künstler